just imagine. A bitterly cold night on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. The wind claws across the sand dunes like the sound of someone mourning. In the distance, beneath a sky thick with darkness, a caravan of camels moves slowly forward, their long necks swaying with the heavy rhythm of each step. On their backs are rolls of silk so light and delicate that it seems a single gust of wind could carry them away, yet valuable enough to be traded for fine horses, gold and silver, even peace between empires. Traveling with that caravan are men long accustomed to danger, merchants, guides, guards, interpreters, monks, exiles, and sometimes spies. They travel in darkness because they fear bandits. They move in silence because they know that one small mistake would be enough for the entire caravan to vanish into burning sand by day and freezing emptiness by night. And yet they keep going, year after year, generation after generation, because at the end of that road there is not only profit, there are magnificent cities whose names alone make the heart tremble. There are markets where a man from Chang'an can stand bargaining with a man from Samarkand, a Persian, an Indian, and someone from the far eastern shores of the Mediterranean. There are scriptures, inventions, dreams, rumors, tales of wealthy kings, of deserts that swallow men whole, of mountains that touch the heavens, and of lands where horses run faster than the wind. And it was on that road that humanity exchanged not only goods, but also beliefs, fears, ambitions, diseases, and destinies. That was the Silk Road. Not a single road, and not a road for silk alone. It was a vast network linking east and west for centuries. It was the nervous system of the ancient and medieval world. It was the place where civilizations touched one another, learned from one another, contended with one another, and changed one another forever. Tonight, I invite you to travel that entire road with me, from the first faint paths before the name Silk Road ever existed, to the age when the Han emperors opened the West, from the life-saving Oasis, towns amid seas of sand, to the glory days of Samarkand and Bukhara, from the footsteps of monks carrying Buddhist scriptures, to the hooves of Mongol horses shaking an entire continent, from the golden glow of trade to the dark shadow of plague, and finally, to the moment when the road itself receded into history, while its legacy continued to live on in the world we know today. Sit back comfortably, pour yourself a cup of tea, or simply be still for a moment, because this is a very long story, and it begins before there was ever silk, before people called it the Silk Road. The world of Eurasia already had invisible veins of exchange. No one planted a sign in the middle of a steppe or desert and declared, "Here begins the road that connects east and west." Things formed more slowly than that, like underground water threading its way beneath dry earth, silent but persistent. Thousands of years before the Common Era, people in lands far apart had already begun exchanging rare and valuable goods. In the east, communities in the Yellow River Basin and beyond already prized jade, metals, horses, and refined crafted objects. In the west, Mesopotamia, Iran, and the regions around the Mediterranean also longed for things their own lands did not provide. One place had strong horses but lacked fine cloth. Another had gemstones but lacked metals. One region had spices but lacked certain crops, techniques, or animals. Human beings were trading long before they fully understood that they were part of a wider system spanning half the world. At first, these were not journeys across entire continents. No merchant of that age traveled in a single uninterrupted trip from China all the way to the Mediterranean. Goods moved hand to hand, from one people to another, from steppe to oasis, from valley to market, from market to city. Each person knew only one stretch, each caravan only one region, but together they formed a current that ran across much of the known world. That is how jade from Central Asia could reach people in the East. That is how ideas about technique, crops, livestock, metallurgy, and even artistic forms slowly moved across space. You see, before the most famous commodity on that road was silk. Perhaps the thing most widely carried along it was curiosity itself. People in one land heard rumors that beyond a certain mountain range there was a breed of horse unlike any they had ever seen. Elsewhere, they heard tales that at the far edge of a desert there was a cloth thin as water and soft as cloud. Such stories made people move, and once people began to move, history itself began to shift. The lands that lay between East and West, especially Central Asia, served as the hinge of the continent. There were vast grasslands, high mountains, enormous deserts, but also oasis settlements, more precious than gold. Every oasis was a small pocket of life in a merciless emptiness. There was water, shade, trade, and news. In time, such places would become vital stations of the Silk Road, but from a very early age they were already lifelines for those willing to travel far. One important thing must be remembered. The Silk Road was not born from pure peace. It grew in a world shaped by war, rivalry, and survival. Nomadic tribes needed places where they could exchange hides, horses, and livestock for grain, cloth, and metal goods. City-states wanted access to exotic raw materials. Empires needed alliances, war horses, and information about distant neighbors. Trade and power always traveled side by side, like two hands pushing the road into existence. Looking back, it is easy to imagine the Silk Road as the product of one grand decision, one decree from some imperial throne. But in truth, before emperors ever paid close attention to it, nameless people had already begun creating it. Horse breeders, guides, salt traders, men who exchanged hides for seeds, mothers who kept a piece of foreign cloth because it was beautiful, blacksmiths fascinated by a new alloy, monks in search of truth, wanderers who went far simply because home no longer offered enough food. Great history often begins with such small footsteps. Then one day, an empire in the east began to look westward, not only with curiosity, but with strategy. That empire was the Han. In the 2nd century BCE, the Han Empire was consolidating its power and expanding its influence. But to its north and northwest there was always a formidable threat, the Xiongnu. These nomadic horsemen were mobile, resilient, and difficult to control. For the Han court, the issue was not merely border defense. They needed to understand the world beyond their enemies. They needed allies. They needed superior horses. They needed to know who and what lay beyond the deserts and snowy mountains, and whether those distant lands might become friends or foes. So, one man was sent. His name was Zhang. If the Silk Road has a symbolic opening figure, it is Zhang. His journey was not a commercial expedition, but a diplomatic and intelligence mission. Yet, its consequences would open a historic gate. Zhang set out in a world in which the Chinese court knew very little about the vast western regions. He did not follow a road already laid out before him. He walked into lands known only through rumor. And from the very beginning, his journey was anything but romantic. He was captured by the Xiongnu and held for years. An ordinary man might have abandoned any thought of returning to his mission, but eventually he escaped and continued westward. Just imagine that. A man leaving his homeland under imperial command, captured in hostile territory, living for years with no certainty of return, and still finding the will to escape and continue deeper into unknown lands. He reached Daiwan, Kangju, and learned of many other kingdoms in Central Asia. More importantly, he realized that beyond Han borders was a world in motion. There were peoples with extraordinary horses. There were lands that cultivated grapes, made wine, and prospered through trade. There were commercial routes stretching far to the west. When Zhang Qian returned, what he brought back was not military victory, but strategic knowledge. He informed the Han court that the west was not an empty wall, but a chain of lands capable of communication, alliance, and exchange. From the Han point of view, this opened three possibilities at once: better resistance against the Xiongnu, access to better horses, and expansion of long-distance trade. From this point on, the Hexi corridor became critically important. It was a narrow strip of land, but a vital one, running between highlands and desert, linking the Chinese heartland to the gateway of the western regions. Whoever held this corridor held the key to the west. The Han court understood this perfectly. They built forts, strengthened military positions, and established systems of protection and administration. Places like Dunhuang gradually became important nodes, both military and commercial. From there, caravans could move toward the Oasis kingdoms around the Tarim Basin, and then disperse even farther. But remember, the Han did not invent the Silk Road out of nothing. They simply did what any wise empire would do. They recognized the value of scattered existing routes and transformed them into a more organized system. Once an empire becomes involved, the scale changes. Goods move in greater quantity. Merchants are encouraged. Military outposts provide at least some measure of security. Envoys travel more regularly. News begins to flow more quickly. And from the weaving workshops of China, the commodity that would most enchant the West also set out: silk. Today we are so familiar with silk that we sometimes forget it once seemed almost magical to people in the ancient West. Thin, light, soft, luminous, catching the light in an almost unreal way, and coming from a distant land wrapped in mystery. The Romans would later desire silk so intensely that it became a symbol of luxury. At times, people even worried that the empire's gold and silver were flowing eastward merely to obtain this fragile cloth. Yet, the interesting thing is that the Silk Road was never only about silk. Silk became so famous that its name attached itself to the whole network. But in reality, the caravans carried countless other things: horses, jade, spices, glassware, coral, ivory, furs, metals, ceramics, paper, dyes, gemstones, carpets, perfumes, resins, dried fruits, and even new plant varieties. In other words, Silk Road is the most beautiful name for a reality far larger than itself. And then the caravans began to multiply. To understand this road, one must understand camels. It is no accident that the image of the Silk Road is a line of camels crossing the desert. The Bactrian camel, especially suited to the cold and dry climate of Central Asia, was one of the great transport machines of the ancient world. It could endure thirst, travel long distances, carry heavy loads, and survive the extreme differences between burning days and freezing nights. Thanks to camels, journeys that would otherwise have been nearly impossible became manageable. But even with camels, the Silk Road was never easy. There was a saying about the Taklamakan Desert: "You may enter, but you do not come out." Winds could erase all traces of the route in a matter of hours. Wells were spaced so far apart that a caravan leader had to remember them as if remembering his own life. The Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Kunlun, and other mountain ranges rose like the walls of heaven, making each pass a gamble against avalanches, bitter cold, and dangerous altitude. Bandits were always a threat. Borders changed hands constantly. An oasis that was peaceful yesterday could be caught in conflict tomorrow. That is why major merchants rarely traveled the entire route from one end to the other. They divided journeys into sections, Goods too moved in stages. A man who knew the road from Chang'an to Dunhuang would exchange his cargo with one who knew the stretch from Dunhuang to Kashgar. From Kashgar, the goods might pass into the hands of Sogdian or Persian traders. Farther west, they might reach merchants of the Near East or the Mediterranean. The Silk Road did not function like a straight thread, but like a chain of interlocking links. As long as each link remained strong, the network would live. And at those links, legendary cities began to rise. Dunhuang, on the edge of the desert, was both frontier fortress and cultural gateway. From there, travelers had to choose, go north or south around the Tarim Basin. Each option had its own dangers. Oasis towns such as Turpan, Khotan, Kucha, Yarkand, and Kashgar served as places to recover, exchange goods, gather news, and change personnel. In such places, markets sold more than merchandise. They sold opportunity. Just imagine a market in Kashgar at its height. You hear many languages sounding together in a sunlit, dusty square. The noise of bargaining, the groan of camels, the ring of metal, the laughter of children, the shouting of men selling horses, dried grapes, carpets, and daggers. The smell of horse sweat mixes with leather, tea, grilled meat, and spices. A Persian in flowing robes stands beside a shaven-headed monk from the east. A Sogdian trader writes in his account book. A guard watches the crowd with suspicion. A stranger has just arrived from a place so distant that most people can scarcely believe it exists. In that place, the world met not through lofty theories, but through very human needs: to buy, to sell, to survive, to profit, and to keep moving. But from this buying and selling, things more enduring than goods began to travel. A monk carried scriptures, an artisan carried technique, a scholar carried a map of the stars, a healer carried herbs and medical knowledge, a family in exile carried the flavors of home, a discharged soldier carried the faith of his people. And so the Silk Road gradually became a road of religion, ideas, and memory. Of all the things that ever traveled the Silk Road, perhaps none left a deeper mark than religion. Buddhism is a prime example. Born in India, Buddhism did not leap instantly into China. It traveled step by step, slowly, through merchants, monks, translations, debates, and small communities in oasis towns. Along the Silk Road, monks and merchants often moved close to one another. That may sound strange, but it made perfect sense. Merchants needed lodging, networks, and places of safety. Temples and monasteries could sometimes provide those things. In return, religion needed carriers of scripture, patrons, and spaces in which to take root. Once again, commerce and belief leaned on one another. From India through Central Asia into China, Buddhism changed gradually. It encountered new cultures, absorbed new languages, new symbols, new interpretations. In Gandhara, some Buddha statues bore facial features and drapery so distinct that one can see Greek influence in them. When Buddhist scriptures entered China, they had to be translated. And translating scripture is not merely transferring words, it is transporting an entire worldview. Translators had to find expressions capable of carrying concepts deep, subtle, and often foreign to the native tradition. To think about that is to realize that the Silk Road did not only connect goods, it connected humanity's intellectual struggles. At Dunhuang, the famous Buddhist cave complexes would later emerge, where wall paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts reflected a world of layered cultural exchange. Every wash of color on the wall, every facial line, every garment depicted in those paintings tells us that no civilization ever develops in total isolation. On the Silk Road, art was the fingerprint of encounter, and not only Buddhism. Other faiths moved along this road as well. Zoroastrianism from Persia, Manichaeism, Eastern Christianity, Judaism, and later Islam. There were periods when, in some Central Asian cities, communities of very different religions coexisted, competed, debated, and at times lived side by side in the practical logic of commerce. Merchants did not always agree in matters of faith, but they understood one simple truth: peace was good for business. Then the Sogdians entered the stage of history as the true masters of Silk Road commerce. If one had to choose a people who best embodied the commercial spirit of the Silk Road, many historians would think of the Sogdians. They lived in Central Asia, especially around Samarkand and Bukhara, spoke an Iranian language, and possessed a remarkable talent for connecting people. They did not need to own the entire road in order to master it. They mastered it through networks. The Sogdians were skilled in languages, adaptation, and mediation. They established communities across Oasis towns and cities, serving as bridges between China, Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. They traded in goods, yes, but also in information, credit, relationships, and trust, in a world where letters could take months to arrive, where borders shifted constantly, and where danger was always near. A network of reliable contacts was more precious than gold. You might imagine a Sogdian merchant as a kind of ancient transcontinental entrepreneur. He knew where horses were scarce, where silk was in demand, where a dynasty had just changed, where war might soon break out, where taxes had risen. He knew whom to bribe, whom to avoid, who kept promises. He knew what gifts to bring to which person, which language to use with each customer, which road was best in this season, which pass to avoid when snow fell early. Without such people, the Silk Road could not have functioned for so long. And at the center of the Sogdian world, Samarkand rose like a dream. Samarkand was not just a city, it was a symbol, a place where the goods of East and West met, where architecture, art, and power intertwined, where beauty walked hand in hand with ambition. To a traveler exhausted after weeks of sand and stone, Samarkand must have appeared like a reward from heaven itself. Gardens, flowing water, crowded markets, glazed ceramics, voices, the smell of baked bread, the sound of hooves, and the overwhelming sense that the world was larger than anything he had ever imagined. But no age of prosperity lasts forever. When Islam rose from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century and spread with astonishing speed, the political map of the Silk Road changed profoundly. Many sections of the route fell within the influence of Islamic dynasties. For commerce, this was not simply a matter of changing flags on fortresses. It created a vast sphere where language, law, currency, and commercial networks could connect more closely. Baghdad, Nishapur, Bukhara, Merv. These names became new hearts of a world of commerce and learning. In that age, the Islamic world did not merely trade. It also sponsored translation, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and geography. Much knowledge from Greece, Persia, and India was received, transformed, and transmitted onward, and the Silk Road was one of the great arteries that carried it. Remember this: goods may spoil, be stolen, or lose value, but once an idea takes root in another mind, no one can drag it back. In a library in Baghdad, a scholar could consult knowledge that had passed through many languages and many lands. In a paper workshop, a technique from the East could be adopted and refined. At a caravan stop, a physician could hear about medicinal plants from faraway regions. In a school, numerals, methods of calculation, and ways of reading the stars could continue their journey across borders. In the end, the Silk Road did not only transport objects, it transported the capacities of civilization itself. But history rarely allows any road to endure long without great war. The 13th century arrived like a storm from the steppe. The Mongols. When Genghis Khan and his successors emerged, all of Eurasia entered a period of enormous upheaval. Cities were destroyed, empires collapsed, populations were slaughtered or displaced. Terror spread everywhere. For many regions, the Mongol horsemen meant apocalypse. And yet, in one of the great paradoxes of history, the empire built by conquest created one of the most secure and interconnected ages of Silk Road trade. Once the Mongols controlled an immense stretch of land from East Asia to the fringes of Europe, they placed many formerly divided regions under a shared order. It was not a gentle order, but it was effective. Roads were more protected in many places. Relay stations and communication systems were organized efficiently. Envoys, merchants, monks, and travelers could move farther across a broader space than ever before. This is the era often associated with what scholars call Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, though it was peace purchased by blood and fire. It was in this context that tales of transcontinental travel became especially famous. Marco Polo is the name most familiar to many people, though he was only one part of a much larger picture. Whatever debates remain over the accuracy of every detail in his account, one thing is certain. Under Mongol rule, the idea of traveling from the Mediterranean all the way to the Far East became more imaginable than it had ever been before. Just think of what it must have felt like for a European of that age to hear of the courts of the East, of cities more populous than anything he had ever known, of gold, silk, coal, paper money, administrative systems, and scales of organization that Europe at the time struggled even to conceive. The Silk Road under Mongol order did not only transport merchandise, it transported astonishment. Yet the more tightly the world is connected, the more easily catastrophe can spread. A road that carries silk can also carry plague. The Black Death in the 14th century stands as the most terrible proof. Its precise origins and roots remain debated in detail, but it is clear that the commercial networks of Eurasia, both overland and maritime, helped move the disease across great distances with unprecedented speed. A flea, a rat, a bundle of goods, a ship, a caravan. That was all it took for prosperous cities to become graveyards. Imagine a merchant arriving at the gates of a city. Yesterday, he heard there was a bustling market. Today, the gates are closed, and people whisper of sickness. A few days later, bells toll without stopping. There are too many dead to bury. Physicians are helpless. Priests pray. The living panic. And the roads that once brought wealth now carry dread. That is the cruelest underside of global connection. When we are linked by benefit, we are also linked by danger. After the brilliant and brutal centuries of Mongol power, the Silk Road did not vanish overnight. It still lived, still traded, still moved. But the balance had begun to change. Political instability, dynastic shifts, new taxes, regional wars, the weakening of key urban centers, all gradually made the overland system less stable. At the same time, on the sea, a quieter but decisive competition was unfolding. In truth, maritime trade had always been important. Arabs, Indians, Persians, Southeast Asians, and Chinese all had long traditions of seafaring and commerce across the Indian Ocean. But from the late medieval into the early modern age, sea routes became more and more attractive compared with long, dangerous, and expensive land routes. A large ship could carry far more cargo than a caravan of camels. The sea, too, was full of danger, but in economic terms, its efficiency was immense. Then the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Then came the Dutch, the English, and other maritime powers. The balance of global trade shifted. The overland roads that had once been the arteries of the continent increasingly faced competition. Some oasis towns were no longer crowded as before. Some cities slowly lost their role as intermediaries. Sand began to gather where once the world had met. That is what often happens in history. A road does not die from a single blow. It dies because the world changes the way it moves. But if you think the Silk Road is merely a past buried under sand, that is not quite true, because when a physical road declines, its spiritual and cultural legacy continues to live. Look around us today. Paper once traveled from east to west, helping transform the way humanity stored knowledge. Gunpowder, techniques, textiles, motifs, musical instruments, foods, fruits, medical methods, artistic ideas, storytelling traditions, religions, borrowed words. So much in modern life bears the traces of long encounters along these ancient trade routes. Even the way we imagine the world as a connected space has kinship with the Silk Road. Of course, today we have airplanes, container ships, the internet, and satellites. But the basic principle remains the same. Where goods move, ideas move. Where interests move, power moves. And where people move, stories move with them. That is why, when telling the history of the Silk Road, we should not tell it only through dates, kings, or quantities of merchandise. We must tell it through human lives, through a Han soldier standing guard in the desert wind, wondering what lies farther west, through Zhang, who returned after years of hardship and changed the way his empire viewed the world, through a monk carrying scriptures over snowy passes, believing the teachings in his arms were worth more than his own life, through a Sogdian merchant teaching his son how to judge a man's face, how to remember the wells, how to separate truth from rumor, through a weaver in the east who never knew that the silk he made would one day enchant a noblewoman in the west, through a child born in an oasis, growing up hearing so many languages that he no longer knows who counts as a stranger, through a librarian in an Islamic city copying knowledge that had traveled across many borders, through a mother clutching her child and fleeing from plague, as the roads that once brought livelihood now brought death, through a sailor on the Indian Ocean, unknowingly becoming the sign that the age of land routes was fading, and through ourselves, sitting here today, still living in a world shaped in part by journeys taken thousands of years ago. But the story is still long, and I want to lead you back once more through its concrete stages, as though we ourselves were traveling with a caravan across the continent. Let us imagine we depart from Chang'an, that city, the glorious capital of the Han and of several later dynasties, was not only a political center, but also a spiritual center of the East. There were palaces, officials, craftsmen, soldiers, scholars, envoys, and a confidence that this was the center of a great order. Yet from that city, silk, lacquerware, metal goods, paper, and countless crafted products were also sent outward. From treasuries, workshops, great markets, and government offices, goods were gathered, inspected, taxed, licensed, or exchanged. A caravan leaving Chang'an was not a disorderly procession. Such a journey required careful preparation. One had to choose the right season. One had to store provisions. One had to buy or hire camels, horses, guides, guards. One had to know which stations were friendly and which were dangerous. One needed letters of introduction, gifts, small coins, and sometimes even secret information for negotiation along the way. The first stage carried travelers through the Hexi corridor. This strip of land was like the narrow neck of a bottle connecting the vast Chinese heartland to the gateway of the western regions. On one side lay the more familiar world of China. On the other began a harsher space smelling of desert, frontier, and uncertain maps. Dunhuang appeared like the last gate before the road became truly unforgiving. Here, travelers repaired equipment, prayed, gathered information, hired more help, changed animals, and in their hearts understood that from this point onward, every step would cost more. Many who left Dunhuang never returned. From Dunhuang, the road split into multiple branches around the Tarim Basin. If you went north, you might pass through oasis towns such as Hami, Turpan, and Kucha. If you went south, perhaps through Moran, Khotan, and Yarkand. Each place had its own character, its own language, its own goods, and its own kind of danger. One might be famous for strong horses, another for jade, another for music, cloth, or gifted interpreters. Khotan was especially fascinating. It was renowned for jade and silk, and in legend was tied to stories about the secret of sericulture being guarded or smuggled out. Whether or not such tales were embroidered over time, they reveal something important. Technology and production secrets were forms of power. Whoever controlled the source of silk held a major advantage. After passing the Tarim Oases, the caravan moved toward Kashgar, one of the greatest crossroads of the Silk Road. From there, routes continued across the passes into Central Asia, or branched in other directions. Kashgar was a kind of hinge. Anyone traveling far left some trace there. It was a place where people exchanged not only goods, but news of the world. News on the Silk Road was as important as water. Where had unrest broken out? Which kingdom had changed rulers? Where had taxes risen? Which pass was blocked by snow? Which desert wells had dried up? Which tribe had turned to raiding? It was through such fragments of information that the network functioned. A wealthy merchant was not simply a man with valuable goods. He was a man with better information than his rivals, and perhaps human history has not changed very much in this regard. Only the tools have changed. Today, it is digital data. In the past, it was a whisper in a roadside inn. From Kashgar, the road opened into true Central Asia, a region layered with many civilizations, Persian traces, Hellenistic influences from the aftermath of Alexander, Iranian-speaking communities, nomadic groups, and later, the powerful imprint of Islam. Nowhere did this cultural mingling appear more vividly than in cities such as Samarkand and Bukhara. At Samarkand, I want you to pause for a moment. If the Silk Road is a great long song, then Samarkand is one of its finest refrains. This city was not wealthy merely because goods passed through it. It was wealthy because it knew how to turn that passage into lasting vitality. Artisans learned new techniques. Administrators learned how to tax, protect markets, and build reputation. Intellectuals learned foreign tongues, copied foreign texts, and translated foreign ideas. Artists saw new fashions, new faces, new patterns from distant lands, and turned them into fresh forms of beauty. A city like that could never be closed. It lived by opening itself, though always selectively. That is why the Silk Road did not merely create rich merchants. It created some of the first truly international cities in a deeper sense. These were places where people had to learn to live with difference. Of course, there was rivalry, contempt, violence, and intrigue. But in the end, because of shared practical interests, people had to learn coexistence. Notice this: whenever trade routes flourish strongly, human tolerance for difference often increases too, at least in the great centers of exchange. Not because everyone becomes kinder, but because everyone understands that if every stranger becomes an enemy, the market dies. And when the market dies, everyone grows poorer. From Central Asia, goods and people continued onward to Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. In the opposite direction, Roman glassware, metals, jewelry, luxury, goods, silver, gold, wine, and many other products moved eastward. Not everything traveled the entire distance, but the network was continuous enough for value to move across it. Some items became so expensive by the time they reached their destination that only the very wealthy could afford them. Silk was the clearest example. In Rome, silk was both adored and controversial. Some loved it for its beauty. Others condemned it as too thin, too luxurious, morally corrupting. Some worried that the empire was spending too much of its wealth on a product from a distant land beyond its control. It is almost amusing, and yet deeply human, that a piece of cloth could provoke debates over economics, morality, and identity. But that was the power of the Silk Road. It made societies that seemed unimaginably distant think about one another, whether they wished to or not. And luxury goods were not the only things that mattered. More ordinary items changed history too. Fruits, crops, irrigation methods, saddle designs, paper making, sugar production, dyeing techniques, and metalworking. Each of these may seem like only a small thing, but over centuries, such small things accumulated into great transformations. Let us talk about paper. Before paper became widespread, preserving knowledge was costly. Bamboo, silk, parchment, papyrus. Each writing material had limitations. Papermaking developed in China and gradually spread westward, and once it was adopted, refined, and expanded, humanity's ability to copy, preserve, and circulate text changed dramatically. What does that mean? It means ideas lasted longer. Laws could be recorded more reliably. Commercial accounts could be kept more effectively. Religions spread more quickly. Science could accumulate more steadily. An invention truly changes the world only when it begins to travel, and the Silk Road was one of the roads that carried it. But once again, I want to return to individual human beings, because if we speak only of large historical processes, we risk forgetting the price paid by each person. Imagine a middle-aged merchant who has traveled this road for more than 10 years. He has a wife and children in some faraway city behind him. Around his wrist is an old thread tied there by his daughter before he left. He knows that if he is to cross a mountain pass this season, he must do so before the snows deepen. He knows which guard prefers a gift in the form of a fine knife, which prefers coins, and which cannot be joked with. He knows which well holds water that is slightly salty but drinkable. He knows how to read the sky for sandstorm winds. He knows that a friend may become a rival after a profitable deal. He knows that great profit is not always worth his life, and yet every year he goes again. Because at home, one successful journey may be enough to sustain the family for an entire year. Because trade is a gamble, but it is the only gamble he truly understands. Because once a person grows used to the horizon, it is difficult to spend an entire life behind the same old walls. The Silk Road lived because of such people, not only because of kings. Of course, kings mattered too. Any empire that controlled an important stretch of road wanted to profit from it. Taxes, protection fees, licenses, markets, diplomacy, garrisons. All of these formed the political infrastructure of the route. A wise empire understood that if it squeezed too hard, merchants would take another way. If it provided enough protection, it would grow wealthy for longer. A foolish empire turned its own section of the road into a trap, and then the flow found other channels. That is an eternal lesson of commerce. During the age when the Islamic world expanded, some sections of the Silk Road benefited enormously from wider networks of law, money, and learning. Not every place was peaceful, but many routes became more interconnected within a relatively coherent cultural political sphere. That encouraged both trade and scholarship. Imagine a city like Bukhara in its prime. By day it was market and workshop. By night it was oil lamps, scholars, scribes, merchants discussing account books, and religious teachers instructing students. Its buildings, domes, courtyards, and narrow streets all held the vitality of a society that knew it stood on one of the great arteries of the world. And then see suddenly, bad news would arrive. An army was approaching. A dynasty had collapsed in the east. Or a new plague had appeared. On the Silk Road, no one lived apart from the larger currents of history. Trade brought wealth, but it also meant that great shocks traveled farther. A crisis in one region would eventually affect another. If a mountain pass was blocked, a distant market would feel the shortage. If a major city was destroyed, hundreds of interpreters, traders, craftsmen, lenders, and scribes could lose their livelihoods. If a new empire arose with an open policy, an entire route might come back to life. So, to tell the history of the Silk Road is also to tell the history of interdependence. Today, we call that global connection. In the past, people simply knew that their lives depended on lands they had never seen. And then the Mongols came. I want to tell this part more slowly, because it is one of the greatest turning points of all. When the Mongols burst out of the steppe, many cities faced for the first time a military force with a speed, discipline, strategy, and level of ferocity that left them stunned. Many resisted and were swept away. Stories of destruction traveled like lightning, enough to make other cities tremble before the Mongols had even arrived. But after that violent phase of conquest, the Mongol Empire had to govern. And in order to govern a space so vast, it needed trade, envoys, taxes, and communication. A land burned to the ground may provide the thrill of victory for a moment, but a trade route that functions well provides benefit for much longer. For that reason, under several successors, the transcontinental trade routes were protected and organized more effectively on a grand scale. Merchants could receive special travel privileges. Relay stations made communication faster. In some periods, movement across vast territories became easier than before. That is what made the Silk Road under Mongol order so vibrantly alive. Do you see the irony of history? There are empires built in blood, and yet they end up opening greater channels of exchange than anyone before them. Marco Polo is often remembered as the symbolic face of this era, but more important than his individual story is the feeling of the age itself. The world became imaginable in its connectedness. People began hearing of distant courts not as pure fantasy, but as places that could be described in reports, travel accounts, and diplomatic letters. Things that had once been rumor could now become testimony. And then disease traveled too. I do not want to make this part too heavy, but the history of the Silk Road cannot be told without death. The more efficient a network becomes, the fewer barriers remain, and the greater the opportunity for disease to spread. Along the great trade routes, people, animals, goods, and parasites all move together. A crowded city, a great market, a port, a warehouse. Any of these could become a link in catastrophe. The Black Death of the 14th century did not only kill, it shattered confidence. People did not fully understand why the disease came, so they blamed, prayed, fled, and despaired. Many commercial communities broke apart. Many cities weakened, many roads slackened. When populations fell sharply, purchasing power, production, demand, and security were all affected. If wealth was the light of the Silk Road, plague was its longest shadow. Still, history does not stop in tragedy. Humanity recovered, adapted, rebuilt markets, and restored networks. But by then the stage of the world was quietly shifting from sand and stone to water. The maritime routes linking China, Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa had long been strong, and now they became stronger still. Ships carried more. Costs per unit of cargo were better. Some goods no longer had to endure countless exchanges across land. The sea, of course, was cruel too. Storms, pirates, disorientation, shipwreck. But in terms of efficiency, it was beginning to win. Then Europe entered the age of maritime expansion. Once direct sea routes to Asia were actively developed, the irreplaceable role of many overland stretches of the Silk Road weakened sharply. Some cities that had lived by transit began to lose their glory. Walls that once welcomed the world now held only the wind. Markets, once crowded with unfamiliar languages, grew quiet. In some places, sand crept into abandoned buildings. Elsewhere, local wars drove the final nail into the coffin of a once vital route. Do you know what is saddest? It is not a city destroyed in a single night. It is a city that dies slowly in forgetfulness. No trumpet sounding the alarm. No final decisive battle. Only year by year. Fewer travelers, less cargo, less money. Fewer young people. Staying behind. Courtyards once filled with footsteps become thick with dust. Inns, once glowing with light, close their doors. And a generation later, someone looks around and asks, was this place really once that important? That is how many points on the Silk Road passed into silence. But once again, the silence of stone is not the death of memory. Today, when we speak of globalization, of supply chains, of cross-border connection, of trade reshaping identity and power, we are speaking in modern language about very old principles. The Silk Road is one of the earliest great proofs that when human beings seek to cross distance in order to exchange, the consequences always extend far beyond buying and selling. You exchange goods, and then you also exchange taste. You exchange technology, and then you also change productivity. You exchange ideas, and then you also change the way you think about life. You exchange religions, and then you also change the way you understand death and salvation. You exchange books, and then you also change the way you teach your children. You exchange crops, and then you also change landscapes and meals. You exchange routes, and then you also change the map of power. The Silk Road is where all of that happened, over a very long span of time. So if someone asks, what is the true history of the Silk Road? This is what I would say. It is the history of a deeply human desire to obtain what one does not have, to know what one does not yet know, to reach places one has never seen. It is the history of risk, because the farther we go, the easier it is to lose our lives, our money, our homes. It is the history of adaptation, because only those who learn new languages, new rules, and new partners survive for long. It is the history of power, because every profitable road is something empires seek to control. It is the history of mixture, because no one passes through such a wide world and remains exactly as they were at the beginning. And above all, it is the history of connection. I like to think of the Silk Road not as a line on a map, but as a heartbeat, sometimes strong, sometimes slow, sometimes faltering, sometimes seeming almost to stop. But for many centuries, it pumped lifeblood through a vast body called Eurasia. Let us return one last time to the caravan in the night that we met at the beginning of this story. They are still moving. The guide lifts his head to read the stars. A guard tightens his grip on his spear. A camel snorts in the cold. A merchant pulls his cloak tighter, his hand brushing the pouch that holds his money and letters. Far ahead, perhaps there is an oasis waiting, a fire, an inn, a new bargain, a new danger, a new story. They do not know that thousands of years later, people will still speak of their footsteps. They do not know that the road they travel carries not only goods, but the future itself. They do not know that from nights as cold as this, the world will slowly learn to bind itself together more closely. But perhaps they feel it. in some deeply human way, that ahead, despite the danger, there is still something worth continuing toward, and perhaps that is the true spirit of the Silk Road. Not only silk, not only gold, not only empire, but the belief that distance can be overcome by courage, by necessity, by intelligence, and by footsteps that refuse to stand still. If today we can sit here and look back at the history of a road that once connected so many worlds, then perhaps the most beautiful thing is not to marvel at the wealth it created. The most beautiful thing is to understand that humanity, even in its harshest ages, has always searched for ways to reach one another, whether by camel, by ship, by an unfamiliar language, by a piece of silk, by a sacred text, by a letter, by a memory. The Silk Road ended as a classical trade network that once dominated the world, but its story never truly ended. It lives on in the cities that still stand in Central Asia. It lives on in museums, in maps, in fragments of cloth, shards of pottery, statues, and scripts. It lives on in food, in religion, in music, in language, in inventions that traveled across the planet. And it lives on in the very way we understand that history is not made of isolated worlds, but of long encounters. If you have traveled with me all the way here, across deserts, oases, empires, markets, monasteries, wars, plagues, decline, and legacy, then thank you very much. And if you love long, slow, deep historical stories like this one, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment to let me know which land or age you would like us to journey into next. Perhaps in the next video, we will once again sit down together and open another ancient road, another lost empire, or another secret still sleeping beneath the dust of time. But for now, I wish you a peaceful night. And remember, every great road in history, in the end, begins with a single first step.